All right, let's just dive right into this. When most people think of Dune, their minds instantly go to this massive sci-fi epic, right? Giant sandworms, massive desert battles. But if we peel back those layers for a second, what we're really looking at is a totally tense, 10,000-year-long geopolitical thriller. Seriously, it's an absolute masterclass in institutional power, economics, and this incredibly delicate balance that somehow keeps a galactic civilization from just tearing itself to shreds. So, in this explainer, we're going to break down the political structure of the Imperium, piece by piece, to see exactly how this colossal house of cards was actually built, and, spoiler alert, why it eventually fell.
I really want you to just let this quote sink in for a second. 10 millennia. We're talking 400 generations of unbroken, absolute dynastic authority by House Corrino. I mean, the sheer duration of their reign had literally passed from history into myth. The political landscape was so thoroughly shaped by them that the system and the dynasty were, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same thing. And then, a teenager from a desert planet riding a sandworm at the head of an army of fanatics just swoops in and takes the whole thing from them in a single afternoon? No way, right? The dramatic irony is just mind-boggling. So how does an empire that strong collapse that fast? Well, to understand the fall, we've got to understand the foundation.
So let's move into Section 1, the balance of power.
Okay, so the architecture of the Imperium basically functioned on this tripod system, and it was brilliantly designed to prevent absolute power. You had the Emperor, who held the executive authority and the military force. Then the Landsraad, which represented the collective political will of all the noble houses. And finally, the Spacing Guild, who held a complete, total monopoly on interstellar travel and banking. The sheer genius here is the deliberate gridlock. It's like a giant puzzle, where any two legs of this tripod could team up to check the power of the third. Literally no single faction could dominate without the consent or, the inability to resist of the other two.
And this entire tripod? It was bound together by a foundational treaty known as the Great Convention. Formed way back after the ancient Battle of Corin, it was the ultimate political settlement. Think of it as the ultimate rulebook that kept rival factions from completely annihilating each other. Most famously, it enforced a strict universal ban on using atomic weapons against human targets. Basically, if you broke the Great Convention, the rest of the universe would instantly unite to wipe you out. No questions asked.
Now let's talk about that third leg of the tripod, the Spacing Guild. They were the ultimate bottleneck for the entire universe. Without their mutated navigators folding space, all trade, all banking, and all military movement, it just stopped. They didn't even want to rule. They literally just wanted to profit and keep things exactly as they were. If you somehow angered the guild, they could just hit you with a travel ban, leaving your planet entirely isolated to just starve in the dark. Talk about leverage.
Moving on to Section 2, what is a great house?
So, here's a crucial point. A great house, or house major, isn't just a bunch of traditional medieval lords living in space castles. Not at all. It's actually better to think of them like massive corporate conglomerates. Sure, they rule entire planetary systems, but economically, they act a lot more like capitalist shareholders in a system we could call corporate nobility. They're out there fiercely competing for market share, resources, and influence. Pretty much exactly like modern mecha corporations.
And just to clear up a super common misconception, when we talk about the Atreides army or Harkonnen soldiers, we are not talking about billions of blood relatives. A great house has its fiefdom, its flag, and a massive standing army of subjects who swear fealty to the ruling dynasty. It's a lot closer to the setup of Julius Caesar. The millions of people serving under them are deeply loyal citizens and soldiers of that corporate empire, rather than, actual cousins and uncles.
All right, Section 3, the wealth of CHOAM.
Of course, all these fiercely rival corporate nobles needed a marketplace to compete in, right? Which brings us to the economic engine of the universe, CHOAM. This is the absolute commercial center of the Imperium. Now, the Emperor holds a massive 25% share, which is huge, obviously. But notice that it isn't a controlling stake. The other 75% is divided up among the great houses of the Landsraad, with the Spacing Guild and Bene Gesserit kind of chilling in the background as silent partners. Influence in CHOAM translates directly to wealth, and in this universe, wealth translates directly to political power, for sure.
Which brings us to arguably the most famous rule in the Imperium. He who controls the spice controls CHOAM. The spice melange, which is only found on the harsh desert planet of Arrakis, is literally what makes guild navigation possible, not to mention it extends human life. It is, without a doubt, the single most valuable commodity in existence. So the Emperor's ability to decide which house gets the contract to mine the spice on Arrakis, that is his absolute ultimate political weapon. and his greatest reward.
Let's get into Section 4, the major factions.
So now that we've got the rules and the money down, we absolutely have to start with House Corrino. They sat on the Golden Lion throne on Khitan, and their 10,000-year rule, it was secured by the Sardaukar, easily the most feared military force in the universe. But what's truly fascinating is how they made the Sardaukar. They didn't just run them through boot camp. They used their ancestral home, the incredibly brutal prison planet of Seleucus Secundus, as this ruthless environmental filter. Literally, only the absolute toughest survived the planet's conditions. It forged an invincible army built through pure, brutal natural selection.
Then we have the bitter rivals. First, House Atreides on Caladan. They governed with honor, loyalty, and respect, building up this immense political capital and widespread popularity within the Landsraad. Now juxtapose that with House Harkonnen. They were incredibly brutal and exploitative, but, and we have to admit this, highly effective managers. They held the Arrakis fiefdom for 80 years, basically bleeding the planet dry and amassing unimaginable wealth. It's a total classic clash, political respect versus sheer, unapologetic economic ruthlessness.
And just a quick aside for fans of the expanded lore, we've got apocryphal factions like House Ordos. Based on the freezing ice world of Sigma Draconis, they represent a totally different kind of power. They produce zero physical products, relying entirely on trade, immense wealth, sabotage, and super high-tech Ixian weaponry. It just goes to show that in this universe, having massive wealth and a talent for deception can sometimes totally substitute for a loyal standing army.
But hey, we absolutely cannot forget the ultimate unseen hand in all this, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood. They were essentially the silent partners of the Empire. They completely avoided direct rule, and instead they opted to quietly manipulate noble bloodlines across millennia through strategic political marriages and this massive, highly secretive breeding program. They were playing the ultimate long game, while everyone else was just fighting over the present.
Which leads us to Section 5, the Arrakis Trap.
So how did this perfectly balanced machine actually fall apart? Let's look at the explosive catalyst of our story. The 81st Emperor, Shaddam IV. Well, he wasn't a fool, but he was definitely afraid. House Atreides had just become way too popular in the Landsraad. Other houses were starting to look at Duke Leto's honorable style of governance as a very viable alternative to Corrino rule. So Shaddam disguised his betrayal as just a routine administrative transfer. He ordered the Harkonnens off Arrakis and handed the massively profitable spice fiefdom over to the Atreides, deliberately placing them in a highly dangerous, totally unfamiliar environment. Once the Atreides were trapped on Arrakis, the Emperor sprung the snare. But here's the thing, he couldn't just attack them openly, right? The Landsraad would instantly unite against him for breaking the rules. So he secretly lent his elite Sardaukar troops to the Harkonnens. Disguised in Harkonnen uniforms, it gave him perfect plausible deniability. To the rest of the universe, it just looked like a standard, albeit super tragic, feud between two rival houses, rather than a sanctioned imperial execution.
But the fatal flaw in the Emperor's grand plan was a massive, completely devastating intelligence failure. Both the Empire and the Harkonnens looked at the native Fremen of Arrakis and just saw a population. A minor logistical nuisance getting in the way of spice harvesting. What they completely missed was that the Fremen were a vast, highly organized, culturally united civilization. That harsh desert had acted as an environmental filter for them, exactly like Seleucus Secundus did for the Sardaukar, creating millions of seasoned warriors whose capabilities far, far exceeded the Emperor's own troops.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 6, End of an Empire.
That massive intelligence failure leads us right to the collapse, where the rigid structures of the Imperium finally snapped. At the Battle of Arrakis, the completely unassessed Fremen army absolutely shattered the foundation of Corrino military superiority. They completely routed the Sardaukar. Paul Atreides, who had survived the initial trap, now controlled the planet, the spice, and an absolutely unstoppable army. He demanded the throne. And to appease the Landsraad and keep up the illusion of a legal succession, a political marriage was arranged with the Emperor's daughter, Princess Irolan. This bridged the dynastic gap between the old regime and the new.
This whole sequence just totally reveals the true tragedy of House Corrino. For 10,000 years, their strategy was all about patient, subtle management. But Shaddam IV encountered a threat he just didn't think he could manage, the sheer moral popularity of the Atreides. So he chose outright elimination. By abandoning a 10,000-year winning strategy of careful political management in favor of brute force, he literally set in motion the exact conditions that allowed an unassessed variable, Paul and the Fremen, to completely destroy his dynasty.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. When we step back and look at this entire house of cards,
The immense wealth of CHOAM, the absolute fear of the Sardaukar, the stranglehold monopoly of the Guild. Who truly ruled the galaxy? Was it the Emperor sitting on his golden throne? The Spacing Guild who could literally starve a planet with a single word? Or was it the Bene Gesserit, silently pulling the genetic strings in the shadows? Power in this universe is never simple, and the moment you think you have absolute control, you might just lose it in a single afternoon. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helps you see the sheer political genius behind the story the next time you dive into this incredible universe.